Let's get started. The River Offering. Around 800 BC, somewhere along the banks of a cold, fast-moving river in what is now northern France, a priest carried a bronze sword to the water's edge. The blade was perfect. It had never been used in battle. He bent it until it snapped, and then he threw it in. Not because the war was lost, because winning the next one required exactly this payment. Rivers were not obstacles to the Iron Age mind. They were living thresholds, breathing boundaries between the world of the seen and the world of the unseen. To deposit something precious into a river was not to discard it. It was to send it forward, into the hands of whatever governed the current beneath the current. Across Celtic Europe, this belief was not a fringe practice. It was one of the most sustained, organized, and expensive religious behaviors the ancient world ever produced. The Thames alone has yielded over 500 Bronze and Iron Age weapons, including the Battersea Shield, dated between 350 and 50 BC, and the Waterloo Helmet, both of extraordinary craftsmanship, both clearly made to be destroyed. At Duchkov in the Czech Republic, a single bronze cauldron, deposited around 300 BC, contained over 2,000 fibulae and personal ornaments. Strabo and Posidonius both recorded Celtic tribes throwing gold and silver into sacred lakes. The Roman general Caepio reportedly extracted 50,000 pounds of gold and silver from the sacred lake of Tolosa around 106 BC. That gold then vanished without explanation. The detail that cuts deepest is not the scale, it is the manufacturing intent. Many of the objects recovered at river sites show no wear, no use, no evidence of any function except to be offered. These cultures were producing objects of exceptional craftsmanship purely so that they could be bent, broken, and surrendered to something that could never hold them. That is not superstition, that is a theology with an economy built around it. They were not throwing away what they no longer needed. They were paying a debt to something that lived in the water, maintaining a contract whose terms we have entirely lost, and doing it with the most valuable things they owned. Fire purification. Once a year, in the dark weeks before winter, every hearth fire across Celtic Britain and Ireland went out, every single one. Homes that had burned continuously through harvest and rain were deliberately extinguished. Communities sat in total darkness waiting. And then, from a single hilltop, one sacred flame was lit, and from that one fire, an entire civilization rekindled itself. The two great fire festivals of the Celtic calendar, Samhain on the 1st of November and Beltane on the 1st of May, were not celebrations in any sense we would recognize. They were operations. The division of the year into dark and light halves was not poetic. It was cosmological architecture, a system that understood time as something requiring active maintenance. Medieval Irish texts, including the Dinshentjas, record the hill of Tlachtka, known today as Ward Hill, as the site of the Great Samhain fire from which all of Ireland's fires were relit. Every community sent a representative, every hearth waited. Caesar's Gallic Wars and Strabo's geography both describe Celtic fire rituals in terms that suggest the Roman authors found them deeply unsettling. The Wicker Man tradition, recorded by both writers, involved burning large human-shaped structures as purification offerings. At Danebury Hill Fort in Hampshire, archaeologists have found evidence of massive, controlled burning events inconsistent with domestic or defensive fire, their scale suggesting something organized and repeated across generations. The specificity of the timing matters here. These were not spontaneous acts of worship, they were scheduled. The truly disorienting detail is what happens when you look beyond Europe. The Aztec New Fire ceremony, the Tzimolpili, required the extinction of every fire across an entire civilization every 52 years, followed by a night of total darkness in which the population waited in genuine terror for the new flame. The Roman Vestals maintained a sacred flame whose extinction required the responsible Vestal to be buried alive. In Vedic India, the Agnihotra rite treated the daily fire as the axis around which the cosmos turned. If fire purification was merely folklore, no civilization would have attached the death penalty to its failure. Every culture that practiced this treated the flame's extinction as the literal end of the world. That is not a regional superstition. That is a shared memory of something so catastrophic that 100 separate cultures independently decided fire was the only thing standing between existence and oblivion, the votive deposit. In 1981, archaeologists excavating a waterlogged site at Fiskerton in Lincolnshire found a timber causeway stretching into an ancient river channel. They found weapons, they found tools, they found personal objects arranged in the mud with obvious deliberateness. When they analyzed the pattern of deposition, they found something that stopped the project cold. The objects had been placed at specific recurring intervals. Those intervals corresponded to lunar and solar calendar events. Someone had been making scheduled offerings to this site for over a century. Votive deposits are among the most archaeologically visible behaviors of the Iron Age, and yet they remain among the least explained. To deposit a votive object was not to abandon it. The Latin root is clear: it was a vow made material, a promise expressed as an object surrendered. Across Celtic Europe, these deposits cluster in bogs, rivers, pits, and caves, following a consistent internal logic that archaeologists are still working to fully decode. The objects chosen were not random. Weapons, personal ornaments, and occasionally human remains appear in combinations too consistent to be accidental. The Fiskerton deposits, analyzed in detail in a 2003 publication by Field and Parker Pearson, spanned from approximately 457 to 317 BC, a period of 140 years of continuous, calendrically structured ritual activity. The Lyn Charig Bach hoard on Anglesey, discovered in 1943 during wartime airfield construction, contained over 150 Iron Age metal objects, including slave chains, swords, chariot fittings, and cauldrons thrown into a lake over approximately 150 years. The Snettisham Torcs in Norfolk represent over 170 gold and electrum objects buried in multiple phases across generations, an investment of wealth that would have taken lifetimes to accumulate, deliberately placed in the ground. The slave chains at Lyn Charig Bach are the detail that historians rarely pause on. Someone deposited the instruments of human bondage as a sacred offering. Whether that represented liberation, gratitude, or something with no modern equivalent is a question the mud has not answered and likely never will. When a civilization maintains a lunar deposit schedule for 140 years across generations who never met, the institution behind it is not a folk custom. It is a bureaucracy of belief, complete with priests, calendars, and enforcement mechanisms. The question is not whether the ritual was real. The question is what they believed would happen if they missed a payment, the sacred grove. There were places in Iron Age Europe where Roman soldiers refused to enter, not because of enemy combatants, not because of difficult terrain, because of what was hanging from the trees and what was living in the silence underneath them. The Nemeton, the sacred grove, was the primary sacred space of Celtic religion across Britain, Gaul, and Anatolia, predating, and in many regions, entirely replacing fixed temple architecture. To Roman eyes, shaped by stone forums and marble colonnades, the idea of an open woodland clearing as the most powerful religious site in a civilization was incomprehensible. But the classical sources are unanimous on its reality and its power. Lucan's Pharsalia, written in the 1st century AD, describes a druidic grove near Massalia in terms of genuine horror. Altars continuously smoking, trees stained with blood, ground carpeted with offerings, and even the priests afraid to walk there at midday. That is not a Roman author exaggerating for effect. That is a Roman author reporting what he was told by people who had been there. Tacitus describes the Roman assault on the sacred groves of Mona, the island of Anglesey, in 60 AD. The legionaries, veterans of campaigns across the known world, halted at the shoreline. On the opposite bank stood black-robed women screaming curses. The groves behind them were attended by druids with their hands raised. The soldiers stood still until their officers shamed them into crossing. When they reached the far bank, they burned everything. The excavated sanctuary at Ribemont-sur-Ancre in northern France makes the literary sources feel restrained. Thousands of defleshed human bones were found arranged into architectural structures within a sacred enclosure, a nemeton that used human remains as building material, maintained and added to over decades. This was not the aftermath of a battle, it was construction. The nemeton was simultaneously a temple, a courthouse, a treasury, and an execution site. When Rome wanted to destroy Celtic military and political resistance, it did not prioritize the hill forts. It burned the groves first. Rome understood, even if it would not say so plainly, that the groves were where the power actually lived. The swords were secondary, the trees were the state, the burial rite. In 1978, archaeologists excavating a burial mound near Hochdorf in Baden-Württemberg, Germany, broke through into a chamber that had been sealed for approximately 2,500 years. Inside, a man of roughly 40 years lay on a bronze couch 9 feet long. The couch was supported by 8 cast female figurines standing on wheels. Around him was a complete feasting service for 9 people. The drinking horns were still hanging on the wall. Iron Age burial rites were not ceremonies of grief. They were logistical operations, and the logistics were staggering. The Hochdorf chieftain, dated to approximately 530 BC, had been provisioned for a destination. His feasting equipment served a specific number of guests, 9, a detail that was clearly not accidental in a culture where numbers carried cosmological weight. At Vix in Burgundy, a woman of exceptional status buried around 480 BC was interred beneath a bronze crater standing 164 centimeters tall and weighing 208 kilograms, the largest Greek bronze vessel ever found, transported across the Alps as a gift or tribute before being placed in her tomb alongside a dismantled chariot. The Pazyryk burials in the Altai Mountains, roughly contemporary at around 400 BC and culturally distinct from the Celtic world, followed the same internal logic. A tattooed woman found at Pazyryk was buried with a mirror, a comb, and a carefully prepared meal, all aligned to specific compass directions. British Iron Age chariot burials concentrated in East Yorkshire at Wetwang and Garden Slack show warriors buried with their ponies still in harness, facing specific directions. Isotope analysis of multiple British Iron Age burials has shown that the interred were sometimes transported significant distances to their burial sites, selected for their resting place by criteria we cannot yet reconstruct. The Hogdorf couch is the detail no one fully resolves. In a warrior culture, the chieftain's eternal rest was supported by female figurines, not warriors, not ancestors, women. That inversion, in the most prestigious burial context imaginable, was deliberate. If burial rites were purely ceremonial, Iron Age communities would not have spent years of communal labor furnishing a room that no living person was ever meant to enter. They believed the dead could still act, still influence, still require. The provisions were not symbolic. They were practical. The question is what the dead were expected to do with them. Ancestor worship. Around 600 BC, in parts of Iron Age Britain, the dead did not stay buried. They were exhumed, curated, moved, and kept in proximity to the living. Not as horror, as protocol. The physical evidence is unambiguous. Excavations at Danebury Hill Fort in Hampshire and Maiden Castle in Dorset revealed Iron Age storage pits containing disarticulated human bones, arranged alongside animal remains, and grain in combinations too consistent to be refuse. These were structured deposits, placed according to a logic that governed which bones went with which objects in which configuration. The Sculptor's Cave at Covesea in Moray, Scotland, a site occupied across the transition from the Bronze to the Iron Age, contained hundreds of human bones, many belonging to children, with evidence of repeated visits and deliberate rearrangement across centuries. Some bones showed cut marks indicating defleshing, a preparatory rite, not a sign of violence. Caesar, in his Gallic Wars, records Celtic warriors preserving the severed heads of notable enemies in cedar oil and displaying them to guests with evident pride. He frames this as barbarism, but Diodorus Siculus, writing independently, confirms the practice, and the archaeological record at Roquepertus in southern France reveals a sanctuary with stone porticos carved with niches specifically designed to hold human skulls. The head, in this theology, was the seat of the soul. To keep the head was to keep the person. Irish brain law, preserved in 7th and 8th century manuscripts but reflecting much older oral tradition, includes legal provisions for obligations owed to ancestors. In the Iron Age legal imagination, the dead had standing. They could be owed debts, they could hold claims, they were not gone, they were elsewhere, and elsewhere had rules. Isotope analysis has confirmed that bones were transported across significant distances after death in multiple British Iron Age contexts. Someone decided that certain remains needed to be in specific locations. That decision required effort, planning, and a theology in which geography after death mattered as much as geography in life. The dead, in this worldview, had not departed. They had simply changed address, and the forwarding required careful management, the hill fort ritual. Hill forts dominate the Iron Age landscape of Britain and Europe. We have called them defensive structures, storage centers, proto-urban settlements. All of those things are true. But beneath the ramparts, in the pits that archaeologists have spent decades excavating, there is evidence of something else entirely, a ritual calendar written in grain and bone, maintained across generations with a consistency that suggests not folk practice but institutional religion. Barry Cunliffe excavated Danebury Hill Fort in Hampshire across 20 field seasons, between 1969 and 1988. What he found in the storage pits changed the way Iron Age studies understood the relationship between the practical and the sacred. Of the approximately 2,500 pits identified, a significant proportion contained structured deposits, not food waste, not discarded refuse, but arranged combinations of grain, animal bone, and human remains placed in configurations that repeated across different pits, different phases, and different decades. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental. Someone was following a template. Evidence of large-scale feasting at Danebury and multiple other British hill forts points to communal gatherings of a scale that exceeded any domestic explanation. Cunliffe identified concentrations of processed animal bone at specific internal locations consistent with periodic organized feasting events. The hill fort, in this reading, was not just a place people lived, it was a place the community assembled to perform acts that kept the world in order. Aerial photography and LiDAR surveys of British hill forts have since revealed internal structures, post alignments, and enclosures oriented to solar and lunar events, invisible at ground level and unconnected to any defensive or domestic function. The Breedon Hill Fort in Worcestershire offers the detail that concentrates everything. Around the 1st century BC, following what appears to have been a siege, over 50 skeletal remains were found concentrated at the gateway. Many were decapitated. The skulls were not scattered. They were arranged in rows on either side of the entrance, symmetrically, deliberately, like columns flanking a door. Whoever arranged those skulls was working from a plan. The gateway was being defined not by architecture, but by the dead. And the arrangement was too precise, too deliberate to be anything other than a statement, written in bone, addressed to everyone who passed through. Animal sacrifice. In 1977, archaeologist Jean-Louis Bruneau began excavating a rectangular enclosure in the fields of Gournay-sur-Aronde in northern France. What he uncovered over the following 7 years was not a settlement, not a cemetery, not a battlefield. It was a liturgical calendar made of animals, maintained without interruption for generations, so precisely organized that the species of each deposit, its location within the enclosure, and the stage of decomposition at which it was moved could all be mapped against a repeating ritual sequence. Over 2,000 animal remains were recovered at Gournay, comprising cattle, horse, pig, sheep, and dog, each species deposited according to rules that governed placement, timing, and treatment. Cattle were left on the central altar to decompose for up to a year before being transferred to the surrounding ditch. The process of decay was not incidental, it was liturgical. The slow surrender of flesh to the ground was itself the offering, not its conclusion. Horses were the most prestigious sacrifice, their deposits consistently associated with warrior equipment, suggesting a ritual class of offering tied to martial vows and specific social obligations. Caesar describes Druidic sacrifice theology in terms of transaction. One life offered to prevent or repay another. A cosmological accounting system with precise rules for what counted as valid currency. The sanctuary at Ribemont-sur-Ancre, operating on the same ritual logic as Gournay, combined animal and human remains in identical depositional patterns across the same period, suggesting the theological framework made no categorical distinction between species when the account required settlement. The Ely Shrine in Gloucestershire, dated to the Romano-British period, yielded over 2,000 animal bone deposits alongside curse tablets directed at specific named individuals. The sacrifice at Ely was targeted. It was weaponized theology. Then there is the bog butter. Hundreds of deposits of carefully preserved animal fat, sealed in wooden containers and buried in bogs across Ireland and Scotland, span from the Bronze Age through the medieval period. Some containers were over 1,000 years old when found. The fat inside was still edible. No secular explanation accounts for the scale, the care, or the deliberate choice of bogs, environments specifically selected for their preserving properties. A civilization maintaining a 2,000 animal liturgical calendar, species by species, season by season, for centuries, is not practicing superstition. It is practicing a science. The fact that we no longer recognize the science does not mean the system lacked rigor, the bog body ritual. In 1984, peat cutters working Lindo Moss in Cheshire broke through the surface and found a human face looking back at them. The man had been dead for over 2,000 years. His skin was intact, his beard had been trimmed, his fingernails were manicured, and he had been killed 3 separate times. Lindo Man, radiocarbon dated to a range spanning roughly the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD, died from a blow to the skull, a garrote tightened around his neck, and a cut to his throat, all applied in close sequence. This triple death is not forensic confusion, it is a pattern. Irish mythological texts and Norse cosmological tradition both describe ritual killing requiring death in 3 simultaneous or sequential forms. The Havamal, the Norse poem attributed to Odin, describes him hanging on the world tree, wounded by a spear, for 9 nights, a death that was simultaneously hanging, stabbing, and suspension, the triple form echoed across 2 distinct religious traditions, and now confirmed in the physical evidence of at least one preserved body. Lindoman's stomach contents included a burned cereal cake and pollen from mistletoe. The plant Pliny the Elder identifies as the most sacred in Druidic ritual, harvested specifically on the 6th day of the moon. Tollundman, found in Jutland, Denmark, dated to around 400 BC, was hanged with a braided leather rope and contained in his stomach a carefully prepared gruel comprising over 40 plant species, a last meal of deliberate nutritional complexity. Graubalman, also from Jutland and dated to approximately 310 BC, had his throat cut from ear to ear. His hands showed no calluses. He was not a laborer. He was found in the deepest section of the bog, the location of maximum preservation. Over 1,000 bog bodies have been recovered from northern European bogs across Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Ireland, and Britain, with a statistically significant proportion showing evidence of violent death combined with exceptional physical preparation. The preparation is the part historians tend to skim past. Lindoman was groomed, painted with iron oxide, fed a ritual meal, and killed 3 times. If that was a punishment, it was the most elaborate punishment in the historical record. And if it was not a punishment, if he arrived at the bog knowing what was coming, then the question is not what was done to him. The question is what he believed he was doing. The cosmological sacrifice. Julius Caesar was not a man easily unsettled. He had crossed the Rubicon, broken the back of the Gallic Confederacy, and documented human suffering with the detachment of a surveyor. But in Book 6 of his Gallic Wars, written around 50 BC, he reaches for language that feels different from the rest. He describes figures of vast size whose limbs, formed of wickerwork, are filled with living men, set on fire and left to burn. Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, writing independently from separate sources with no political alignment to Caesar's agenda, confirm the practice in general terms. 3 classical authors, 3 corroborating accounts. The Wicker Man was not a rumor, it was a scheduled event. The theological logic Caesar records is the detail historians consistently fail to sit with. The ritual was not performed in response to crisis, it was not an act of desperation or punishment. It was calendrically fixed, a scheduled delivery of life to whatever governed the cosmic ledger, performed at determined intervals, regardless of whether the year had been good or bad. The victim preference hierarchy Caesar records moves from condemned criminals considered most pleasing to the gods through prisoners of war and then, when supply ran short, to innocent citizens selected by lot. The lot was not experienced as injustice, it was experienced as selection. Flagfen in Cambridgeshire and several other waterlogged Iron Age sites across Britain preserve evidence of large-scale burning events with associated human and animal bone in proportions inconsistent with accidental or domestic fire. The archaeology does not prove the Wicker Man, but it does not contradict it either. What it confirms is that fire on a large scale involving human remains was a recurring feature of the Iron Age sacred calendar, and that the people performing these acts were operating within a theological framework of extraordinary internal coherence. That coherence is what mainstream history has never fully confronted. The Druidic cosmological system, reconstructed from classical sources and later Irish mythological texts, understood the universe as a system requiring periodic rebalancing. Death given freely was not loss, it was payment. The fire was not execution, it was accounting. And the innocent person chosen by lot was not a victim in the sense we understand the word. They were a representative, sent on behalf of everyone who remained. Caesar burned the groves and suppressed the priesthoods and wrote the history himself. 2,000 years later, we accept his account when it confirms our sense of superiority and dismiss it when it complicates that comfort. But the archaeology does not share our discomfort. The groves were real, the bones were real, the schedules were real, and somewhere underneath all of it is a theological system so total, so internally complete, and so completely lost that we are still pulling its fragments from bogs, groomed and painted and perfectly preserved, waiting for someone to ask the right question. What runs through all 10 of these rituals is something historians tend to resist naming directly. These were not primitive behaviors, waiting to be replaced by reason. They were the products of sophisticated theological systems with internal logic, institutional support, calendrical precision, and multi-generational continuity. The Iron Age mind understood the world as a place that required active maintenance, a cosmos that could fall out of alignment if the payments were missed, the fires were not relit, or the offerings were withheld. Every river deposit, every votive pit, every prepared body lowered into a bog was a transaction made by people who believed, with total conviction, that the transaction mattered. The fact that we cannot reconstruct the full terms of that contract does not mean it was irrational. It means we have lost the theology that made it coherent. These rituals were not what Iron Age people did instead of understanding the world. They were how Iron Age people understood it. Go to the comments and tell us which of these rituals unsettles you most, and why. The ones that make you uncomfortable are usually the ones closest to something true. If this changed how you see the ancient world, subscribe. We are just getting started.